Hello, hope you're doing well. We have arrived at the peak of spooky season, which means it's time to celebrate in the best way that I know how, by making a similarly spooky speed paint. Before we get into the thick of it though, since this is a series all about essentially info dumping about some of my favorite things, I do want to take a really quick minute to mention a tool that may be helpful if some of you guys are also hankering to express yourselves and your hyperfixations in a similar fashion, namely with a clever little program called Demo Creator. If you haven't heard of Demo Creator before, it's essentially an all-in-one video making multi-tool that allows you to not only live stream and record your screen for whatever video making purposes you may have in mind, but also to edit your videos and audio with a bunch of pre-made templates and an easy-to-learn interface. If you want to try out something a bit more VTubing adjacent as well, they also have a bunch of options for virtual avatars that you can integrate right into your videos, streams, and even business presentations, as well as a voice-changing feature and a special effects store where you can go to pick up some fun, flashy bonus content to really help you get creative with your creations. The shiny new Demo Creator 6.0 is available right now, and while it is free to try, they do also have either a subscription plan or a perpetual license available. And honestly, because you guys know I love a bargain, the perpetual license is way more affordable than a lot of other video editing software out there. I was honestly quite surprised seeing the price, so it definitely gets bonus points for that. If you would like to try it out for yourself anyway, there's going to be a link down in the description, and if you do end up trying it out, I would recommend sharing your creations to your preferred social media with the hashtag #PresentWithDemoCreator, because you could end up winning a prize from the folks over on the Demo Creator YouTube channel. Anyway, with that recommendation in mind, and a big thank you to Demo Creator for sponsoring this video, let's get back to the festivities. Now, where was I? Oh yeah. That's much better. It wouldn't be a Halloween video without a proper costume, after all. Now, you'd better be sitting comfortably with a collection of candy handy, because today we're going to be taking a look at a fresh collection of delightfully dark musicals, and translating some of their most horrifying hits from the stage to the page. Let's get started. Alrighty, I am feeling festive, I am ready to go, and there is even a thunderstorm happening outside at the minute. We've had quite a few of them in the UK this week and they've all been pretty intense, so everything is feeling very aligned for Halloween, which is lovely. However, as per the annual tradition, before we do dive headlong into today's video, I would like to recommend that if you haven't already seen my other Monster Month musical themed videos, that you do maybe go and check them out after you're done watching this one, or beforehand. The order doesn't really matter, because if you do not see your favourite show getting drawn this time around, chances are that I might have already covered it in a previous episode. But anyway, as far as today's installment goes, I wanted to kick this one off with the maximum possible amount of queer, campy, Halloweeny energy right off the vampire bat, so to speak, by finally drawing the much requested, the one, the only, the Rocky Horror Show. It's certainly been a long time coming, and honestly I can't help but wonder how it's taken me this long to finally draw the show with horror in its literal title in my horror-themed speed paint series, but you know, hopefully better late than never. Specifically with this piece anyway, even though the original Rocky Horror Picture Show movie starring Tim Curry is an absolute cinematic treasure, I actually ended up drawing a lot more inspiration from a couple of more modern performances of the on-stage version of the musical. For anybody who may not be familiar, by the way, Rocky Horror is a show about... Well, truth be told, even though I have seen the Rocky Horror movie multiple times and even watched a few different stage versions this week while looking for inspiration for this drawing, I honestly could not tell you what happens in this show, because to this day I am still not 100% sure what happens in this show. What I do know is that it is iconic, and, you know, despite the areas of it that do admittedly absolutely bewilder me, it is practically impossible not to enjoy it. The roughest approximation of the plot that I could give you though, without spoiling anything or mixing up too many details, is that Rocky Horror is basically the story of a very straight-laced, very repressed couple who stumble into the castle-cum-laboratory of a character who can only be described as an insatiably horny mad scientist called Dr. Frankenfurter. Not to be confused with Frankenfurter's monster, who, at least in this show, is recognizable as the muscular himbo in the gold spandex underpants. And from there, a lot of other stuff happens, and all of it is also very horny. Now, to take a step away from the decidedly rambunctious plot for a moment and get back to this particular drawing, the song that I ended up taking inspiration from for this one is called Sweet Transvestite, and it is the song that Frankenfurter himself is introduced through, strutting into the room on the beat and swooshing a big sparkly cape all over the place. And before you ask, yes, I was originally going to try and draw something for the Time Warp instead, since that is the very first song that anyone would think of when you mention Rocky Horror, but after watching a few different versions of the stage musical, I just absolutely loved the staging and choreography for Sweet Transvestite, and how much more big burlesque energy that it took on when it was translated from the screen to the stage. Plus, it seemed like a song that I could actually represent visually without having to draw quite as many characters as the Time Warp might have ended up needing, so that was definitely a bonus. For all the pieces I worked on for this video, I gathered references by going through and watching various performances of these songs on YouTube and taking screenshots of any moments I could see that had cool poses and lighting and expressions, before, appropriately enough, kind of Frankensteining the most visually interesting bits and pieces together into one fun composition. In this instance, I took a liking to this one moment in the Sweet Transvestite song that seemed to be in every version of the stage show that I could find, wherein Brad and Janet are physically knocked to the floor by the sheer queer energy emanating from Dr. Frankenfurter during the final chorus. The different height levels of all the characters, as well as the fact that Brad and Janet also have their gazes transfixed on Dr. Frankenfurter posing dramatically between them, ended up making a really nice triangular composition that really helps to lead your eye up to Frank's face. I assume Frank is the first name. It could be Furter, it could be N. I don't know enough about this character. For Frank and/or N and/or Furter's pose, anyway, I used the 2015 performance of Rocky Horror Live as my main point of reference, because every now and then during the song, the actor would strut to the edge of the stage and do these fun little hip bumps that I just immediately grabbed a screenshot of because I was like, that is a fun pose, I really want to draw that. So I did. I definitely recommend checking out that particular performance, by the way, if you are looking to watch a full version of the Rocky Horror Show online. Certainly the stage show, at least. I know you can rent the actual movie from different places, but again, we're talking about the musical theatre version, so I'm going to stick with that. But yeah, the entire taping of that one is available on YouTube. That's how I ended up watching it. It's from a performance in London's West End, so nice and local for me. And it starred, I believe, David Bedella as Frankenfurter, and he did an amazingly incredible job in the role, as well as having a bunch of UK celebrities on as guest narrators. Everyone from Stephen Fry to one of the original hosts of the Great British Bake Off to the actor who played Riff Raff in the original movie, who I believe also wrote the show in the first place, actually, if memory serves. So definitely an all-star cast, and definitely a prime example of what Rocky Horror is like in general, since it was filmed in front of a live theatre audience, and Rocky Horror is one of the few, if not only, big stage musicals that actually encourages the audience to shout out punchlines in the middle of the show, which is honestly so unique because normally that is a cardinal sin of live theatre. It's kind of reminiscent of the kinds of festive pantomime shows that we have here in the UK, actually, in that regard, which to some degree does also explain the amount of campness in the whole affair. I did also reference the 2013 version of Frankenfurter for the costume as well, since the bright red outfit that they have him in for some of those performances felt a little bit more glamorous and colourful, and like it would be certainly a lot more fun to do the colouring on. Also, one fun difference that I did notice between the two performances is that the actor from the 2015 performance felt like they had energy somewhat closer to Tim Curry's in the movie, while also being very, very much in their own element throughout the entire show. And the actor for Frankenfurter in the 2013 cast, at least I think, brought what felt like a more modern drag queen kind of energy to the role, which is really interesting because it's an earlier version. That's one thing I really do love about musical theatre, is how a bunch of different actors can all put their own spin onto the same character and completely make it their own. Which, actually, now that I mention it, is a pretty relevant topic upon which to move along to our next drawing of the day. So this is another one that I am surprised it's taken me this long to get around to drawing, since it's been a really beloved show for me ever since I can remember, and it is Wicked. I honestly don't know if there's anyone left who hasn't heard of Wicked by now, since it's been such a majorly popular show for such a long time, but if you somehow do not know of it, Wicked is a musical prequel to The Wizard of Oz that focuses specifically on the life and times and turning points of a green-skinned character called Elphaba, or as she's better known to most people, the Wicked Witch of the West. It's a spectacular show that completely subverts the witch's wicked role in that movie, and at multiple points, if not the whole way through, it can get very, very dark. On a more personal note, Wicked is also the show that I first remember really sparking my love for musical theatre when I was a kid. I had the Kerry Ellis rock version of Defying Gravity on my busted up iPod Nano back in secondary school, and I used to listen to it all the time. And then my earliest memory of actually going to see a musical in person was when my grandparents took us to see Wicked in London's West End. And I was practically jumping out of my seat every time a new song started because I was so excited to be seeing them live. And when the opening chords for Defying Gravity started playing, forget jumping out of my seat, I was jumping straight out of my mind with that one. I was so excited and it was absolutely magic. Looking back, it really is a wonder how none of my family, myself included, realized that I was gay back then, because really there's no heterosexual explanation for that amount of excitement at a musical, so... Anyway, the reason that I said this piece was relevant to that whole train of thought about how different actors can breathe different kinds of life into the same role is that because Wicked has been running for so long in so many places around the world, there have been a ton of performers who have played Elphaba over the years. I don't really keep up with the fandom side of musical theatre since I'm more of a soundtrack appreciator than anything, but to the best of my knowledge, it's kind of like a Pokemon situation where there are too many to count, but every single one is guaranteed to be somebody's favourite. Up until now, some of my favourite versions of Defying Gravity, which is like the title song, again, if anybody is somehow not familiar. But yeah, some of my favourite versions of Defying Gravity have always been, like I say, the Kerry Ellis rock version from Wicked in Rock, but also some really top-notch covers by Caleb Hyles and Anna Pantsu right here on YouTube, plus another really great rock cover that I found a bit more recently by a guy called Matt Copley. Having said all that though, I should probably mention that this particular artwork actually wasn't inspired by the Defying Gravity song itself, even though again, that's probably the first song that anyone would think of at the mention of Wicked. Instead, I took inspiration from another song that falls during a point in the show where things really do start to turn onto the more horrific side of things, called No Good Deed. And while No Good Deed isn't necessarily a song that I'd listen to quite as much as Defying Gravity, even just while looking for screenshots to use as a reference for this artwork, I ended up finding a ton of outstanding performances of it that I'd never seen before. In particular, and I wrote this down because I knew I wouldn't remember the names, but there were a couple of recordings of performances by Emma Hunton and Donna Vivino that were really good, as well as another great cover by Anna Pantsu that I definitely recommend checking out. I'm an absolute sucker for a good riff or an opt-up in a musical theatre performance, and there's no shortage of those to be found with those guys. You'll already know that I'm also a sucker for German musical theatre as well, so I'd really love to show some appreciation for the, I think it was Hamburg pronunciation, not my forte, but there was one German production of Wicked which had really fun staging where there was like an old Technicolor TV that crashes onto the stage for when Dorothy arrives, and Elphaba goes flying over the audience instead of rising up on the big fabric contraption that most performances tend to use at the end of Defying Gravity. Just a couple of really fun changes that I thought were super fun. I realize I've said fun twice there, but that's because it was double fun, I suppose. But yeah, while we're on the subject of alternate language versions anyway, first off, I've got to admit I don't remember who it was that was playing Elphaba back when my grandparents took me to see Wicked when I was a kid, but if I could remember, then I think it's pretty safe to say that that would be my favourite Elphaba, hands down, just because they were the one to provide me with that really lovely memory. But as far as a performer who I can actually name right now is concerned anyway, I think my favourite Elphaba at the time of recording this has got to be, and I am so sorry in advance if I butcher this pronunciation, but I think it's pronounced as Wilhelmine Verkeek. It's got a J in it somewhere, but I'm trying my best. In any case, you might have seen her on TikTok. Certainly that's where I first saw her performing, in what I believe was a German or Swedish like stage rehearsal of No Good Deed, and I was blown away just by that alone, but then I found out that she's apparently played Elphaba in 5 different languages. I could go on all day about how impressive that is, but basically after looking up a few performances of hers while I was looking for reference material, she ended up being someone whose performances really stood out in my mind while I was working on this piece, and I would definitely recommend checking out some recordings of her work if you can find them. Since there have been so many amazing Elphabas over the years anyway, I did wonder if maybe drawing a whole bunch of different versions of her into one composition might be a fun way to go for this one. In the end though, I decided to focus less on the amount of actors who've played her, and more on some of my favourite aspects of the actual song itself. Namely the fact that there's a whole bunch of smoke and atmospheric lighting and cape swooshing involved in the staging for it, and that it really lets whoever's playing the character show a vast range of emotions, everything from crashing to the floor in grief to screaming at the ceiling in rage. And to echo that, I decided to put one more grief-stricken looking figure at the bottom of the canvas front and center, and then a bigger, smokier, much angrier looking silhouette clawing at the air behind her all lit up in green. I don't really know what possessed me while I was working on the sketch for this one, but I am really happy with how the anatomy and expressions ended up taking shape, especially on the background character. And I had a ton of fun playing around with the lighting and coloring to try and balance the dark dress of the Elphaba in the foreground against the black background and bright green smoke behind her. Adding a bit of purple rim lighting to the foreground figure really did the trick, I think. Anyway, I've rambled on quite long enough about this one for the moment, so I think it's probably about time to move along to the final artwork of the day. I feel like it's almost a tradition at this point for these Halloween musical speed paints to include at least one show that's inspired by classic literature. So we're going to be going from a composition with a little bit of green grief and fury to one with a hefty dose of good and evil and murderous intent, with a piece inspired by the Jekyll and Hyde musical, which, if you've never covered the book in your English classes, is the story of a scientist called Dr. Jekyll who tries to rid the world of evil by separating the good and evil aspects of people, but in using himself as a test subject ends up unleashing a murderous entity that calls itself Mr. Hyde. Specifically, this drawing is based on the song Confrontation, where Dr. Jekyll, towards the climax of the show, tries to put a stop to the crimes of the evil persona inside himself by any means necessary, while Mr. Hyde tells him that his efforts are pointless because, he is in fact the real him, which is obviously quite an upsetting conundrum for dear old Dr. Jekyll. Very fun for everyone involved. Not least of all because traditionally, Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde are roles that are both played by the same actor, which can make a song like Confrontation, which is essentially a duet, really gripping and just fascinating to see play out. It takes a ton of skill to be able to switch between those two emotional extremes as quickly as the song calls for, like being very scared and being very scary. And much like with the previous two pieces, I ended up watching a bunch of different versions while I was gathering reference material, and some could be absolute hits, while others ended up as more of a swing and a miss when it came to nailing the delivery and the singing and the atmosphere all in one go. It's really tricky stuff. Needless to say, the original cast recording version by Anthony Warlow is of course outstanding, but like I say, there were also quite a few other versions that really managed to hit the nail on the head. For instance, Caleb Hyles, to name him again, actually did a very good rendition ages ago that might have actually been the first time I ever heard this particular song. And then there were some old tapings of a couple of fellas named Brent Ramirez and Robert Cuccioli, again, I hope I'm pronouncing that right, but both of them performing it on different stages, and the physicality and vocal growls in both of their versions absolutely slapped. That's another favourite thing of mine. If it's not riffs, if it's not oct-ups, it is vocal growls. If you have gravel in your voice, sign me up. I want that in my ears all the time. It sounds so cool. I'm hearing back what I just said, and I realize it might have been a bit of a weird phrasing, but we're going to ignore it. I'm going to carry on. Yeah, there was even one, I think like a high school performance or something similar that I saw, which broke the mold quite a bit and actually did have two separate actors for Jekyll and Hyde. And it kind of turned the internal conflict that is this song, which is normally depicted with like dramatic hair flips and lighting changes, into an actual section of like physical fight choreography between two different actors, which was really fun to see. At first I didn't know if going against the grain like that would end up actually working or being cohesive compared to like the tons of other versions that I just watched where both of these characters are played by one actor, but yeah, goes to show that sometimes making choices that are a little bit outside the box can really pay off, because it certainly worked. Also, David Hasselhoff. David Hasselhoff has also performed this song once upon a time. I have no idea what the context or possible reason for it was, I just know that it happened, and now the burden of that knowledge has been passed on to you. Please do with that information what you will. Having said that though, that slightly goofier bit of trivia there does actually remind me that it is another kind of tradition for these spooky speed paints to include at least some kind of reference to StarKid, and while there haven't been any StarKid shows on the playbill today, I would love to direct you guys to the fact that one of my all-time favourite covers of this very song, genuinely, is sung by one of my favourite StarKid cast members, Joey Richter. I will not spoil the reason for which I enjoy his rendition so dearly, but yeah, I very much would recommend checking it out if you haven't before. Joey Richter, Jekyll and Hyde, Confrontation. Maybe check out the original cast recording version first as a point of reference, and then his, and then I think it will speak for itself. I think you'll understand. But yeah, normally with these musical-inspired pieces as well, I do tend to try and include some of the lyrics from the songs into the picture, but I don't know if I'm going to do that this time around because I really like how some of these compositions ended up looking without any text on them, especially this one in particular actually. I wanted to take some inspiration for the composition of this one from that one rendition with the two actors, and depict this whole song, this whole internal struggle that's going on in a much more physical way. Namely by having both Jekyll and Hyde on screen about to seemingly beat each other up. Or, well, Mr. Hyde's probably gonna beat Jekyll up, I don't think he's very strong. But yeah, I also tried to take some cues from the way that various productions did the staging for this song. There was one production, for instance, that had a really cool, like, projecting a big shadow onto a wall of smoke effect that they were using that looked absolutely awesome, but I kinda already did that for the Wicked piece, so I did want to try something different here. Instead, I took a leaf out of the lighting technician's book and tried to cover Jekyll in warmer lighting while Hyde is wrapped up in a cold blue, which I believe is a color choice that I saw in a Korean version. I also noticed that across the board, almost every rendition had Mr. Hyde ripping his shirt open and making this creepy, hunched over pose with his hand clawing in front of him and his hair falling over his face, which I had a ton of fun trying to replicate here since I don't normally get to push characters into such extreme poses. Same goes for Dr. Jekyll actually. I don't normally get to draw characters looking quite so terrified, especially while tangled up between another character and a swirling scientific concoction, so it was a really fun challenge all round. Also, slightly off topic, but I do want to say I did not have any My Hero Academia pages pulled up to look at as reference while I was doing the sketch for this one, but I really felt like I was putting maximum Shigaraki energy into Mr. Hyde by the time I was done. Look at that face. He could be in the Handman's gang. No one calls him the Handman. What am I talking about? But yeah, between figuring out the poses and playing around with the coloring and just how everything ended up coming together, I think this piece may have ended up nabbing the top spot for me as my favorite out of today's entire lineup. If you guys have a different favorite though, or even if there's just a particular detail from any of today's pieces that really stood out to you, then please do let me know about it down in the comments. But before you go on and head on down, hang about for a minute because it is just about time to take a closer look at all of today's finished artworks. And with that, the curtain closes on another seasonally appropriate chapter of musical theatre appreciation. These continue to be some of my absolute favourite videos to work on because I get to really indulge in my theatrical hyperfixations while working on them, so I do hope that you've all had a lovely time watching along with me today and that you have a very festive Halloween evening, a very festive Halloween ahead. If you have any suggestions for what you'd like to see next time around, or just some recommendations for fun shows that you think deserve some love, then please do go ahead and share them down in the comments. Until next time though, I hope you are all staying as safe, happy and healthy as you possibly can, and, of course, happy Halloween.